we manipulate our bodily states that can actually have a very big impact in how we perceive or memorize things, and even it can affect our decision making. Another testimony of this embodied cognition theory comes from metaphors and abstract concepts, which are grounded in physical experience in our body. For instance, when I say, I am feeding you with information to digest, we are referring to our own body. And our languages are predated with all these bodily metaphors. Now, motor cognition suggests that the motor system participates in high-level mental processes. And I won't go too much in detail. Again, common coding theory posits that perceiving is a way of acting, so the same mental processes engaged in observing are also engaged in performing those actions. And this happens because there is a bidirectional forge between the motor pattern for which that action originates and the effects that it produces. And lastly, predictive coding, or action-based predictive coding, is a theory for understanding efficient coding in the nervous system. And the action-based only means that we emphasize the role of the motor system when we generate such expectations about our environment. Okay, so moving on. The types of studies we carry out deal with the brain integrative function. So brain integrative function only means that we look at how different parts of the brain talk to each other, how the network, how they are connected. Because there are mainly two ways to look into brain function. You have the segregation way, which is which regions respond to a particular experimental manipulation. So here we don't know the relationships between those regional foci of activation. But in integration, we are interested in how those regions interact under a particular experimental task. So the trend nowadays is to move away from segregation and explore the more integrative side of brain function. So connectivity studies are on the rise. So why? What happened? Has it been? Okay, sorry. I had one empty slide there. So okay, why study brain integration? Why is it on the rise? Because I think we have understood that the regions don't operate in isolation. So it can help study the neural footprint also of certain mental states or diseases. Yeah, some neurodegenerative diseases. So yeah, if we understand certain diseases like autism, for instance, or schizophrenia as a brain connectivity disorder, then this becomes really relevant. And of course, in music research, that's what we're interested in. Connectivity allows us to study specific questions. For instance, if intensive musical training can induce connectivity changes in the brain, and which areas are being connected. So that's about brain integrative function. Now we already discussed musical training a little bit. And okay, so we look at this connectivity while the brain is processing real-world complex music. So this is what we call naturalistic music. What I mean is music such as However, in neuroscience, mostly to study how the brain reacts to music, they have been using stimuli, more artificially designed stimuli such as Okay, so you would probably not consider this like a real musical experience when listening to those stimuli, but they are very, very good at isolating the specific dimensions of music. So for that reason, both approaches, the naturalistic and the more controlled one, should be mutually inclusive because they represent the two ends of a trade-off. And so they should inform one another. Now I will talk a little bit about the experiment that we use to examine those brain responses to music. So to record the brain in action, we use fMRI scanner, so which essentially tracks the flow of blood in the brain to see which areas are active or less active when people engage in different activities. Then we had a group of 18 musicians and 18 non-musicians that had to lie down in the scanner and listen to 3 musical pieces of different styles. We had rock, tango, and classical. Now classical. Yeah, so this is called free behavior task because participants only have to listen without performing any task. Of course, we expect them not to fall asleep, but the only instruction is just to attentively listen to the music. So we ended up having about 24 minutes of worth of brain data to analyze per participant. So we have used this data for exploring different questions. So in this talk, I will focus on these studies. So the first study I will talk about is a replication study that we did to actually test the reliability of using such a free behavior paradigm, such naturalistic paradigm. The second study I will talk about looks at connectivity between hemispheres of the brain during music listening. Then the third study looked at how the predictability of the music, how predictable music is while listening to it, how that affects our brain connectivity. And the last study focuses on rhythm processing. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first study attempts to replicate previous findings on which brain areas encode certain musical features to test the reliability of using such more real-life conditions in the lab. So basically the question is, if we repeat the experiment with a new pool of participants, will we get similar results, and how similar? Or maybe totally different. So. Yeah, so basically this is the basic pipeline of the study. Okay, the original study that we wanted to replicate employed this novel naturalistic fMRI paradigm, thanks Pino very much, to predict how the brain responds to 6 specific musical features or percepts that are related to timbre, rhythm, and tonality. And they found that these musical features elicited large-scale, widespread neural responses in different parts of the brain and related to cognition, motor functions, and emotion processing. Okay, so that you have a better idea of these 6 musical features, let's talk a little bit about them. So we had 4 timbral features which refer to the acoustic quality or the color of the sound. So these features are mainly based on spectrotemporal characteristics of the stimulus. Then we have 1 rhythmical feature, which indicates the clarity of the pulse. This is how easy it is for us, for the listeners, to perceive the pulse, like to track the beat. And then we had 1 tonal feature, which indicates the strength of the key, the tonality. Now, what we call timbral features are low-level features because to process them, we depend mostly on more universal mechanisms, low-order sensory processing mechanisms. So they are not really strongly modulated by our listening history or culture, for instance. And the other remaining two, we call them high-level features because to process rhythm and tonality, we require knowledge based on our previous exposure to music and culture and so on. So yeah, they involved higher-order processing mechanisms. Now, let's listen to some samples that illustrate some of these features. For instance, different levels of brightness, low and high level of brightness. So this would be an excerpt of music with low level of brightness. And high. The next feature, for instance, pulse clarity. Low clarity in the pulse would be something like this. So you don't really know how to move to this piece. And here you really can track the pulse. Now, key clarity. So this is very ambiguous in terms of tonality, as opposed to yeah, so as I said, we replicated the study. We used an identical methodology, identical music, identical set of musical features. Of course, a new group of participants with similar demographic characteristics. Then, of course, we didn't have the same scanner, so we used, this was different, actually. And the preprocessing pipeline and statistical pipeline to analyze the data was identical. So yeah, we tried to minimize the differences as much as we could. And so what we found was that low-level features were encoded in similar areas of the brain in both experiments. This is the way highly reliably replicated. And this makes sense because they are dependent on, as I said, more low-order sensory areas, more kind of automatic processing, more universal processing mechanisms. However, the reliability decreased for the higher level features, though we could not replicate those, at least not at the conventional alpha levels of significance. And we believe that this could be explained by higher or larger inter-subject variability when processing these features. So, all taken together, replication was successful. Low-level or timbral features were best replicable than high-level rhythmical and tonal ones, and this is a good thing, and it tells us something more about the music and the features. Then, for instance, that the areas in the brain where these more universal processing mechanisms for these features are located. Then we could not replicate high-level features, probably because of because they respond to more top-down level mechanisms. So there would be larger variability among participants, or maybe could be also limitations in the statistical approach used, which is correlation. Maybe we'd need something more powerful. Then. The study also encourages naturalistic approaches as legitimate choice and complementary alternative to the more traditional approaches that can actually increase the validity of the findings because we are using real music in a passive listening. And supports replication studies to ensure that the published research is robust and reliable. Okay, so that was study 1. Now the study 2 is motivated. It's about the interhemispheric connectivity in the brain. And it's motivated by evidence that suggests that musicians, compared to controls or non-musicians, show more efficient communication or connectivity between hemispheres. And this would make sense because it would represent an advantage for coordinating complex motor behavior between, both hands and so on, or even feet or visual input. So during musical performance. For instance, when we look at the corpus callosum, the area that the white matter tract that connects both hemispheres, allowing transfer of information, it seems to be enlarged in musicians. Specifically the anterior part, which is the part that connects sensory motor areas of the brain. So that would conform to what musicians do. So, and it's important to mention that the corpus callosum usually is a marker of interhemispheric connectivity. Then also when there are studies that look at the white matter fibers, so the axons, and they look at water diffusion in that tract and measure the degree of directionality, and it would seem that musicians exhibit more organized white matter tracts than controls, which is supposed to be due to the plasticity induced by that practice. Also, pianists have been found to show more symmetrical brains in specific areas, specifically motor areas, compared to controls or even other musicians. So there is only one study that used visual stimulation in a very controlled paradigm to the left and right visual fields with pianists, and they found that pianists did not show any asymmetry in terms of the interhemispheric transfer time as opposed to controls. Okay, so all this evidence leads us to hypothesize that maybe musicians show more symmetrical brain activity, especially in motor and maybe visual areas of the brain. And also we thought, if we compare the two types of musicians, we had violinists and pianists. So maybe if we compare them, we could find also symmetry differences there because of the different motor demands of playing the violin as opposed to playing the piano. And what we found was that musicians showed indeed more symmetrical brain activity in those areas than non-musicians. So basically mainly in the motor system, but all other areas as well. And this is consistent with the motor demands of musicianship. The problem here is that we cannot interpret other areas so easily because it would be like reverse inferring from the brain data. But at least with the motor areas showing us more symmetrical, we can deduce that maybe the motor demands have a role there. And likewise, the brains of keyboard players showed more symmetrical responses than those of violin players. So here to explain these, especially in visual areas of the brain, so here we think that, for instance, when pianists are reading musical score, they have a more, it's a more a heavier task than for a violinist because they have two lines of notation for each hand, so they have to transfer visual input to contralateral motor outputs, and so they have to develop more efficiency in communicating between hemispheres. So that's one justification or explanation for this pattern of activation that we see. So yeah, in conclusion, the symmetry seems to depend on specific requirements of the instrument played, on the kinematics and the posture of playing. And this, of course, has implications for cross-modal brain organization because we can see this symmetry in brains that are listening to music. They're not doing anything. So your motor training affects the way you perceive music. So from the motor domain to the auditory domain, we can see plastic changes happening. Okay, this is the study on how the predictability of the music can affect brain connectivity. So, okay, this idea was motivated by a recent study that found stronger connectivity between the hippocampus and cerebellum, those areas that you see there, when participants could successfully predict the timing of movements. So this is specifically the cerebellum, with the left hippocampus seemed to cooperate in integrating spatial and temporal information to predict, to facilitate prediction in a spatial task, visual spatial task. Now, we know that music is crucially linked to prediction. So when we listen to music, one has expectations where the music is going. Because music, like language, is not without rules. So we have these expectations during our listening to music. So we wonder if we could find this network in the context of music listening. And if so, we would expect musicians maybe to show a stronger connectivity in that network than non-musicians. And if so, this would mean maybe that musicians could be able to make better predictions than controls. And that's why the connectivity happens, because in that study it was a marker of accurate predictions being made. So to test this hypothesis, we looked at the connectivity between those areas at the points in the music when it was very easy to predict what, well, in areas in the music where we thought there was some, participants were able to make predictions about the future events. So, yeah. So to get this information, we did another experiment, a perceptual task, but I'm not going to talk about it. But basically, we mark the points of the segments in the music which are related to less probability to guess what's coming later. So in those segments where you can do prediction, so we took those segments and measured the connectivity in those segments between the cerebellum and the hippocampus. And what we found was that only musicians showed increased connectivity between the left hippocampus and these cerebellar areas. Of course, this finding requires further investigation because it's a novel thing that hasn't been studied much. But a possible explanation is that musicians are integrating spatial and temporal information while listening to music, and they are mentally simulating actually sound producing actions that they are used to do while playing their instruments. And these sound producing actions are triggered by the music while they listen to music. And this action simulation helps them to predict the upcoming musical events. It helps them to anticipate the music. So we can think of this as an embodied problem solving in a similar way that climbers, for instance, preview the climbing route for some minutes while trying to figure out or planning, imagining the path or the future climbing path. So in short, this study found a stronger cerebellar hippocampal connectivity or integration during listening only in musicians. And this could be a marker of musicians mentally simulating sound-producing actions. But this is just a speculation. And this study also is the first study of its kind in widening this the cerebellar integrative function in the context of musical prediction. So it would need replication, of course. And the last study is about rhythm, so which I think is one of the most intriguing aspects of musical experience, but we unfortunately know very little about it because it seems that it is very complex to study. So I will say a few notes about rhythm in the human brain. So we know that human experience of rhythm is very hardwired in our biology. Unlike any other species. There's some cross-species research, but and they have found some other animals that can maybe I wouldn't say predict or entrain to the beat because that's not what they do, but they are good at synchronizing with the beat. But when we actually look more closely, what they're doing is not, because humans, we show this negative asynchrony, so we can tap to the beat a bit before the beat comes, so that means that it's prediction, what's going on. But in these animals, what we see is like a positive asynchrony, which means that they are responding to what they hear instead of predicting to what they hear. So in that sense, humans are unique in their rhythmical abilities. Also, humans can entrain to a larger range of tempi or speeds than those animals that they have studied, like this cockatoo. I don't know if you see it on YouTube. It entrains to some pop music, but I think it can only entrain between 120 and 126 beats per minute. So otherwise, it's too slow or too fast. So.